Hello. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Welcome to the webinar series brought to you by the CENTRO Institute. We've got a record turnout today with many new folks joining. So if you stumbled across our webinar and are maybe wondering what CENTRO is all about, I'll give you a brief overview. CENTRO provides software and services for advertisers. Our technology is designed to boost media team and business performance by enabling advertisers to plan, buy, and analyze campaigns all on a single centralized and collaborative platform that we call Basis. Every campaign is supported by an amazing team of media specialists and digital experts who provide our clients with raving fan service at every stage of any campaign. My name is Ryan Manchi. I lead the CENTRO Institute, where we create educational programs and thought leadership initiatives to help you raise your game. Today's webinar is titled Consumer Privacy in the Future of Advertising. I am incredibly fortunate, and I think we all are, to be joined by two experts who I'm lucky to call colleagues. Derek Zollner is a technology and privacy attorney with more than 20 years of experience helping companies big and small find practical solutions to complex problems. Derek is CENTRO's VP of Legal Affairs and leads all of CENTRO's legal and privacy initiatives. Also joining us is Ian Schreider, who is CENTRO's Director of RTV Platform Operations, where he leads the integrations of supply and data partners in Basis and curates technology partnerships for ad quality, inventory quality, and security. He focuses on creating technical solutions and bringing synergy for CENTRO's business and technology teams. And also, if maybe you've seen his name, or if you haven't seen his name, you've probably seen his work or experienced the goodness of it, because he was a key contributor to the ads.txt as well as the appads.txt specifications as part of the IAV working group. So several weeks ago, before most of us really realized the severity of the coronavirus, shockwaves were sent through the ad tech industry, with a blog post from Google that would cause confusion, fear, and what some may say overstated claims of solutions of how the industry is going to approach data-driven advertising. But this change should not be a shock to anyone who's been paying attention to regulations put in place by governments or by technology companies in an effort to provide enhanced data privacy for individuals. So over the next 30 minutes, we're going to dig in to these new regulations that are in place and some of the ones that have been in place for a little while, and talk about what this means for you as a brand or advertiser, agency, publisher, and a provider. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Derek to talk about how government is reshaping advertising. Derek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you for that kind introduction. When Ryan asked me to participate in this seminar, I started preparing remarks a few weeks ago and about how I was going to begin about how privacy and related initiatives presented a potential existential threat to our industry. But when you have an actual existential threat that's happening in the world, it kind of puts in perspective what these actually are and the impact of the privacy initiatives that are taking place on our business. It's not to say that these aren't serious, but in the context of what's going on in the world, they're not as serious as some other things. But we still should pay attention to them, because when we come out on the other side of the COVID crisis, these issues are still going to be there for us, and there's still going to be things that we have to address. So you may have heard of CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's what I think is the tip of the iceberg, or the first of many initiatives that we're going to see at the state level here in the US that relate to consumer privacy. Nevada has already passed a law. Other states are considering it and will pass some form of legislation. Federal legislation may be on the horizon. My personal view is I would invite federal legislation as a means to have some uniformity, so that rather than all of our businesses being forced to comply with 50 different state laws, we are only required to comply with one federal law. But we're not there yet, and so in the interim, we have to deal with the landscape, the regulatory landscape on a state-by-state level. So CCPA is not the end, it's really the beginning. It's the beginning of states and the federal government actively be involved in regulating data privacy issues. Next slide, please. So what is CCPA? It's the California Consumer Privacy Act, and it gives residents new rights regarding their personal data. The origin story for CCPA is kind of interesting. There was a real estate developer in California. He was at a cocktail party, and he was talking to a Google engineer, and he asked the Google engineer something to the effect of, should I be concerned about what companies are doing with my personal data? And the answer was a resounding yes, which caused this gentleman to kick into gear. He recruited two other just regular citizens. They weren't privacy advocates, and they tried to pass a referendum, a statewide referendum in California that would have enshrined consumer protection rights via a referendum. To head that off, the California legislature quickly passed a law, and it went into effect on January 1, 2020. But because the law was so hastily passed, there were a lot of gaps in it. And so the legislature deferred rulemaking to the California Attorney General. That rulemaking is still going on. So you can see, even though the law is in effect, we still don't know the final contours of what the rules will actually be around CCPA. The history on that, the first rules were issued for publication in October of last year. There was a second round of revised rules that came out in February 10th. And then a third round of rules was just published a couple of weeks ago on March 11th. So we're still in a place where we don't know definitively what the actual rules are going to be around CCPA compliance. We have pretty broad understanding, but there's still some specific technicalities that need to be worked out, some of which are quite significant. And part of that is the reason why enforcement of the act doesn't actually begin until July 1st, 2020. So we sort of have a 6-month grace period here. That window may be extended due to the current COVID crisis. I'm hearing inklings of that, but there's nothing definitive of it. But we're planning to have enforcement be in effect as of July 1, with whatever the rules will look like as of that date. What the act really does, it's important to think about it in this context. It doesn't change how companies collect data or provide meaningful restrictions on their use. There are some exceptions to that. Everything has some nuance around it, but that's the top line headline. What it really does, it provides consumers with the right to some transparency about how businesses are using their data, and the right to request that companies stop using their data or stop selling their data. So those are the three main rights that you see at the bottom. Right to know is what it's called in the rules. That's what businesses are doing with the consumer's personal data. The right to have a company delete that data, and then a right to opt out of the sale or future use of that data. Next slide, please. So why should you care? Well, to date, there hasn't really been a meaningful data protection or data privacy law in the United States, especially as it relates to ad tech. Most of it has been done through self-regulatory schemes and principles. So this is the first meaningful broad data privacy law in the US. I think it's a signal of things to come. Because it's California with a huge population, it affects a significant portion of our population and our consumers, customers, the people we're directing advertising to. States now have a way to prosecute these violations, whereas before that would be difficult whenever we were operating under a self-regulatory system. And then, of course, because customers can ask us to delete their data or to stop selling their data for use, it limits our rights to use that data. Next slide. So who does CCPA apply to? It applies to any company that does business in California and meets one of the three criteria listed there. If you have gross revenue in excess of 25 million, you buy, receive, or share personal information of more than 50,000 consumers, or derive 50% of annual revenues from selling personal data. Many of our businesses in ad tech will qualify simply by virtue of number one. If not, if you are processing data or sharing data of more than 50,000 consumers, even if you don't hit the revenue threshold, you still will be, the CCPA will still be applicable to your activities. So broadly put, this is going to affect a lot of people in the ad tech industry. And most of our participants in the ad tech industry, I think, will be subject to these CCPA rules. Next slide. So who's responsible for compliance? Any business to which CCPA applies. That seems obvious on its face, but you can't completely outsource compliance. So if you're the point of collection for collecting data, you're responsible for providing notice of that collection, which is through a privacy policy, and the opportunity for consumers to exercise the rights that I had above. This can be tricky if you think about it in the context if you're an advertiser and you hire an agency to run campaigns. Even as the advertiser, you still will have some obligations if you're collecting data related to those campaigns, particularly if you're collecting data directly from visitors to your website. So if you run an ad through an agency that delivers it through a DSP or some other mechanism, and the visitor clicks on that ad and then, or the consumer clicks on that ad and goes to your website. If you're collecting data from somebody landing on your website, you need to provide notice of that, and you need to provide the opportunities for those California consumers to exercise the rights that I said above. So it's complicated whenever you have multiple parties in the ecosystem who are doing different things. But the simple rule of thumb is if it's happening on your website, you need to have some compliance responsibility around it. Next slide, please. So here's the good news. What happens if you don't comply? The enforcement mechanisms of CCPA are pretty weak. So for violations of the right to know, so if a customer comes to you and requests, makes the right to know request or right to delete or right to opt out, for a company that doesn't comply with those requests, only the California Attorney General can currently bring actions related to that. So the individual who makes the request doesn't presently have the right to sue for those violations. So what this means is the California Attorney General, whose resources are tight and limited, my suspicion is they're likely to only bring enforcement actions against the biggest companies and where they can get the most political bang and publicity bang for their buck. So, you know, those are your biggest participants in the ad tech ecosystem, but it means for the most part, the smaller businesses are unlikely to face actions given the resource constraint at the Attorney General's office. Private individuals are able to sue for one type of violation. If there's, I label it here as a personal data breach. So if you have personal data and there's a data breach, individuals can sue for that, but that's unrelated to their exercise of their right to know, right to delete, and right to opt out. Next slide, please. So GDPR, we just dealt with that in 2018. How's CCPA different? And I highlight this only because GDPR did represent a fundamental change to how data was processed and collected. In most instances, GDPR requires somebody, if you're using their data, to provide affirmative consent. They say yes before you use the data. CCPA doesn't require that. Our current ad tech ecosystem only requires that we provide notice and the right to opt out. CCPA doesn't change that at all. So unlike GDPR, you don't need to get explicit express consent in almost all instances for use of personal data. You just need to provide notice at the time of collection of how you're going to use that data, and then give the back-end rights that I talked about, the right to know, right to delete, right to opt out of sale. The other major difference there are many, but these are two that I found interesting. The CCPA applies to California consumers regardless of where they're located. So if a California resident visits your website from New York or Florida or somewhere else, they still have the same rights whether or not they're physically present in California. GDPR, on the other hand, really is a territorial law. It applies to actions that take place inside the EU. So EU citizens that travel to the US were not required to comply with GDPR as it relates to them. We're only required to comply with GDPR as it relates to collection of data when they're physically present in the EU. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for us in the ad tech industry? Well, self-regulation as the sole mechanism for enforcing good behavior is over. We now have governmental entities who will have those rights and abilities to do that regulation. The DAA and NAI will still have a role to play, but it won't be as the primary means of enforcement for these privacy-related rights. Two, this is, I think, important. This is why I brought up the GDPR comparison. The fundamentals of our data collection and use system are unchanged. We still operate under a notice and opt-out framework, meaning you provide notice of the uses of data in a privacy policy or similar document and allow a consumer to opt out on the back end. Enforcement actions are unlikely given the resource constraints of the California Attorney General and the lack of a private right of action for individuals to sue for violations of the rights exercises. And then this is really, and this leads into where my colleague Ian will speak more fully. I think the technological changes that we're seeing will have a greater impact with the death of third-party cookies and related things that tail off of that. So with that, Ian, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Derek, and thanks, Ryan, for the introduction earlier. So yes, I'm going to be talking about how tech companies, and most specifically the browser makers, are enhancing user privacy and how that affects ad tech. So, of course, the big news is what Google is doing, and that is Google's announcement of their intent to phase out third-party cookies in Chrome within the next 2 years. But that said, Google is late to the party on this. Mozilla took this action in Firefox in September 2019, blocked third-party cookies, and Apple introduced intelligent tracking prevention back in 2017. And it's nuanced, but effectively consider it a ban on third-party cookies. With that said, all of Mozilla, Apple, and Google have now adopted policy positions on tracking. Specifically, the policy positions that they share is that they believe that there should not be cross-site tracking of users. And what they mean by that is not no cross-site tracking via third-party cookies. They mean no cross-site tracking. And of course, cross-site tracking is sort of the foundation of a lot of ad tech functionality. Now, consistent with my remark that no cross-site tracking means no cross-site tracking, they also believe that there should not be covert tracking or circumventions. In other words, the only means of tracking users should be those that the browser provides for. Any attempt at a sort of sneaky or covert method of achieving tracking anyway, or circumventing their attempt at preventing cross-site tracking is viewed as a policy violation by all of these companies as it pertains to the browser. But what's not going to change in any of this is sites will continue to be able to track their own users in the context of that website. On a fundamental level, the web can't work without this, right? All the things that we're used to, like the fact that Netflix knows that you're logged in when you go to Netflix, requires that a site can track its own users. So that's extremely unlikely to change at any point. Now, the next slide is a bit of a state of the union, the numbers here. This is the inventory composition we see on our DSP. It'll vary from DSP to DSP depending on what traffic mix they choose to receive. But for us, we see about 69% of the traffic is in web environments. 31% of it is in app environments, and it's this web environment that is impacted by these actions by the browser makers. The app environment is not specifically impacted, and for now, it is a trackable environment. Mobile advertising IDs exist. That said, it's pretty fair to assume that for logical consistency, that has to change as well. Both Apple and Google both own browsers and operating systems. It would be logically inconsistent for them to say no cross-site tracking in web, but provide the means for cross-app tracking in the app environment. So while it's trackable for now, I fully expect we'll see subsequent announcements that curtail similar tracking in the app environment. But in any event, for a lot of advertisers, their audiences, their first-party audiences or their conversions are happening in a web environment. So even if the app environment remains trackable, that's not going to help for anybody whose data begins life in a web environment. So the next slide is the market share of browsers. So up until now, as I said, Firefox, Safari have both taken action on tracking some time ago. But, that was easier to ignore on account of the fact that they have a relatively small market share. Chrome is 64% of the browser market. But that said, there are some other browsers, one of the biggest being Samsung Internet. There's also Edge, Opera, and browsers like Brave. What happens to those in the future is variable, but many of these browsers are built on Chromium, which is the same engine that drives Chrome. It's most likely that all of the Chromium-based browsers will have the exact same behavior as Chrome. So it's pretty fair to assume that they'll all be impacted the same way. And effectively, this means that all web browsers, after this action occurs, are not trackable via third-party cookies. So the next slide outlines the functionality that is impacted by this. Broadly speaking, when it comes to something like a DSP or an ad exchange, publisher ad server, potentially, anything that uses a user ID is impacted if it happens on the web. Ad tech uses third-party cookies to store user IDs, pseudonymous user IDs, just a unique random number, not tied to any person's particular information, just a unique random number in a cookie that allows that user to be identified for the purpose of audience targeting, frequency capping, and conversion attribution. And it's critical for these things to work that the same ID can be accessed across sites, and that means third-party cookies. So really, third-party cookies are fundamental to all of this functionality in the web environment today. Now, on the next slide, here's my prediction. I think that this means that widespread cross-site tracking of individual users is over. The fact of the matter is that the browser policy is clear, and the browser makers hold a lot of power. Attempting to thwart their position on this is unlikely to be a winning game over the long run, as the browser makers, generally speaking, they can do whatever they deem appropriate to enforce the policies that they want to enforce. So I think the way forward for the industry is the scalable and durable way forward is to find new ways to enable targeting of audiences, attributing conversions, and so on, without the need to track individual users. And of course, that aligns very nicely too with the trend in privacy regulation, which increasingly curtails the ability to track individual users. So the next slide, I'd like to talk about a few sort of non-solutions that I'm hearing about. I'm hearing a lot of confusion in the market about this. And there's not going to be one magic solution that makes everything work the way it used to. It's just not possible on a technical level. So one of the things that I hear is, well, we'll just use first-party cookies. Well, here's the thing about that. A cookie isn't first or third party. A cookie is first or third party in the context in which it's accessed. By that, what I mean is, let's say the user is visiting advertiser.com, page on that site, and a cookie is set for advertiser.com. That's first party. It's happening in the context of the page the user's on. On the other hand, if you attempted to access a cookie for advertiser.com while the user is on anything else.com, that would be third party. It's the context of the access that makes it first or third party. So while it's true that many DMPs support storing an ID in a first party cookie on an advertiser or publisher site, this ID is not available across sites. So you can collect data in terms of that, but this is data that's effectively trapped within the context of that site. You can use it to personalize content on the site, but there's really no direct way to use that to do audience targeting on other websites. Likewise, I've also heard, so this means third-party data is gone, but not a problem. First-party data is better anyway. Well, first-party and third-party cookies is a technical term. It's not really related to first-party and third-party data in a business sense. Online first-party data, like a retargeting audience, for example, still relies on third-party cookies to be targetable, because while the advertiser might collect it on their site, it's got to be possible to somehow recognize the user when they're on another site to achieve targeting them. And that requires third-party cookies. It's first-party data, but third-party cookies are a technical mechanism involved in making it possible to use it for targeting purposes. Another area that I've heard is, well, why don't we use IP addresses? There's a couple of things about that. On a technical level, an IP address identifies an internet connection. Now, an internet connection is not a user. So this, doesn't work for sort of connections that have multiple users on them, and it doesn't work for the purpose of, following a user across different connections. Like a business has many different users on it, for example. An IP address may also not be stable. Residential IP addresses are typically dynamic. It might reset from time to time, especially if the user resets their modem or something like that. And many mobile carriers use something called NAT due to the small number of IP addresses that are available to conserve the address space. A technique is used that allows multiple users to share the same IP address. So that kind of breaks that technically. Now, on a technical level, there is some portion of the universe, small portion, where this would work as a means of tracking. But the other problem here is a privacy one. A good identifier for the purpose of advertising really has two properties. It's visible to the user that they're being tracked, and they can control it, technically. Now, cookies meet both of these criteria, because you can see if a cookie is being set in your browser. You can easily check the browser, and you can see who has set cookies on you. You can destroy them if you want to, and you can turn off your browser's support for third-party cookies if you don't want to be tracked. IP addresses are a fundamental characteristic of traffic flying around the internet, the routing of information across the internet. And so there's really no technological way for a user to exert a privacy preference. And so from a privacy point of view, that's concerning. But it's sort of a case where maybe half the time it could work, maybe half the time it's not really suitable, and when it does work, there's some serious privacy issues there. So the other angle is fingerprinting or other covert tracking. What fingerprinting means is the idea that even if you can't set a unique user ID, store a unique user ID, what if you can collect a bunch of unrelated data points? Let's say the screen resolution of a user's device. Let's say the exact browser version, maybe the list of fonts on their computer. If you compile a bunch of these apparently unrelated data points, then you can end up with, while each of the bits of information isn't unique, collectively they end up uniquely identifying a person, and you can use it like an ID. But this, again, doesn't meet the tests of visibility or user controllability, and it's also explicitly against the policies of all of Mozilla, Apple, and Google. So, there is already practical evidence of what happens if you do fingerprinting. Firefox has introduced fingerprint blocking as of January 2020. It will block the ability for scripts to load from domains that are known to use fingerprinting. And some ad tech companies are already on this list, which will impair their ability to serve ads and do the general functionality in Firefox because they've been caught fingerprinting and have been put on the list. So, this is a part of the cat and mouse game. It's really not a durable long-term solution. Next slide talks about some things that I think are real solutions over the long run. Really the long-term solutions are about doing things differently. So the first is, alternative ways of thinking about targeting audiences. Targeting an audience doesn't need to literally mean a list of user IDs. The fact of the matter is things like third-party audience data, third-party audience data segments can be highly variable in their quality and effectiveness. And often the cost-benefit ratio is just not there. So, with that as the current state, looking to alternatives, I think what's important is, do we achieve useful performance outcomes, not exactly the specific technical mechanism by which the targeting is achieved. So I will give a couple of examples of alternative ways of targeting audiences in a minute. Another possible real solution is PII-backed identity coalitions. So this is things like Brightpool, LiveRamp Identity Link, and so on. This is backed by people's personally identifiable information. So the thing about these, though, and the reason why I put a maybe on this is, in a world in which you can't have cross-site tracking, which you can't store a user ID and access it across multiple websites, the way this works is a publisher who has a logged in user can send an email address or something like that to one of these identity platforms and receive back a user ID and then store that for that publisher. A different publisher who also has a logged in user can repeat the same process and end up with the same ID and store it there. So you can end up, without being able to access it across sites, the same ID in multiple places. But this depends on publishers having logged in users. And this is the big if. Most publishers today don't have logged in users. So are publishers going to attempt to get all the users to log in? Maybe, I don't know. Also, how does this align with the no cross-site tracking position of the browsers? My view is that this might survive if it's all nice, clean opt-in basis. There's a reasonable chance that the browser makers might object to this regardless. And it doesn't seem like there's any chance that this covers anywhere near 100%. Maybe like 20% is what I'm guessing of traffic might be covered by something like this. So it's probably part of the solution, but this isn't going to solve everything. Now, finally, there's browser endorsed mechanisms. And the big example here is Privacy Sandbox, which is Google's loosely sketched collection of ideas on how to handle functionality in the future without tracking individual users. It's very vague at this point. It's just very loosely sketched out ideas, but working with the browsers to do the same functionality but in different ways is really a way forward that's going to be long-term durable. So finally, I'd like to talk about what we're doing. This is specifically with regards to the DSP. The broader non-DSP functionality in Basis isn't specifically necessarily affected by this specific action, although specific vendors that one might use to execute media might be. So this is some things we're doing in the relatively near term. There's going to be much more over time. We're pursuing, the first most important thing is conversion attribution, measuring that campaigns are performing. That's key over everything else. And so soon we'll be introducing cookieless conversion attribution. Now this involves decorating click links with a click ID, storing that in local storage on an advertiser's site, and sending it back home later. This gives click-through conversion coverage, so it's not everything, but this is just the first step in a broader attribution functionality plan. We're doing this without storing a specific user ID. We're intentionally not using user IDs to adhere to the spirit of the browser policies. It's possible that, we'll see how some of the browsers react, some with a more extreme position like Safari, uncertain. But, this is in the spirit of not track the individual user. We are also expanding audience alternatives for targeting and reporting. So some examples of this include things like, first off, because sites can track their own users, publishers will be able to create their own audience data, and publishers can sell that data on bundled with their media via a deal. So that's one way of doing audience targeting in the future. Other ways include, well, for example, already existing today is ComScore content activation for demographic targeting. Via context, via the site or the section of site the user is on, using ComScore's media metrics data, this achieves targeting of demographics, and it does so quite reliably. We've tested it, actually produces very good on-target percentages. But other options include things like hyperlocal targeting or other place-derived targeting, including existing geofencing from Factual, their proximity product. But I can also say that we're exploring further geographically derived audience targeting. Birds of a feather flock together, and there's very strong data sets coming from the world of offline marketing about such information tied to location. We will explore PII-backed identity coalitions. Again, I think it's part of the solution, maybe not 100% of the solution, but it is part of the solution. We will adopt browser developments as they occur that provide privacy-preserving alternatives. Google's developments are some time away still, right? There's 2 years, or a little under 2 years before the trigger is actually pulled. And Google is signaling a willingness to cooperate with ad tech on this. So, so long as we do it without user identity, it's very likely that continued ad tech functionality will remain possible. It'll just be somewhat different. So fundamentally, the how of how these things are done, the audience targeting, the attribution, and so on will change. But I don't think the fundamentals of online advertising will change at all. And there is still quite a long time before the shoe actually drops on this. So there's lots of time to adopt to the changes. With that, I'll turn it back over to Ryan.
Awesome. Thank you, Ian. And thank you so much, Derek. So much information to process. I think the good thing is some folks have already found the tab. If you look over in, I guess it's the right side on mine, but if you look in the tab within the webinar app, there's a questions tab that you can go through and plug in any questions that you've got there. So we're going to see how many we can get through over the next maybe 8-10 minutes or so. The first one that we've got is kind of stemming off some of the things you were talking about, Ian. I think as you were wrapping up there, maybe some different ideas, because we got a few different folks that are asking about this, about any sort of advantage that Google may have in this. A couple folks are saying, well, we've got DFA handling most of our ad attribution. Can we assume that it's still going to function the same, or that it's not going to be affected? Any comments on that, Ian?
Sure. So with regards to Campaign Manager, DFA, or if you've been around long enough, Dart, this has, Google calls it enhanced attribution. It's similar to the cookieless conversion attribution functionality I'm talking about. So that, addresses the immediate matter. But to the broader question of, is there some advantage that Google has as a consequence of their position in the ecosystem? I think it's important to realize that they have multiple, very distinct product lines. So for something like Google search ads, Google search ads are activity happening within the context of a single site. So in that regard, there's nothing special there. They'll be able to continue to create audiences based on data from their own site for use on their own site. There's some challenges around attribution, however, because that involves cross-site data. When it comes to their DSP, just like everybody else, they're serving ads on other websites. It's definitionally a scenario where cross-site tracking is involved. And so there's not, really any reason that the DSP, Google's DSP, is in a special position here. It requires stringing together a bunch of theoreticals about some things that could hypothetically be done, some things that would certainly raise the interest of lots of people looking very closely at Google. And I don't think there's any evidence that there's things they're planning on doing. So on a technical level, Google's DSP is in the same boat as everybody else here. With regards to specific products like search, it's business as usual because that's a single site type of activity.
Gotcha. And real quick, Ian, before I jump over to a question for Derek, the 2-year window that Google, that the Chrome team highlighted in that blog post, when is that? Like, what's that date? What's that time frame? The actual 2-year window ending?
Nobody knows. We'll see. I'm quite sure. First, I believe that Google's privacy sandbox will be much better fleshed out, and I believe that we will have viable production-ready. By this, I mean, both Google, us, the industry as a whole, will have viable production-ready privacy-preserving replacements. I don't think it's likely that this will suddenly proceed without that work getting done first. But I'm sure there will be plenty of notice. It's not something that's going to appear out of the blue one day, but currently there is no exact timeline set.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Number of people asked, we're definitely sending out a recording as well as the slides. You'll get those later today. So you can definitely plan on that to re-review and maybe share with some colleagues. Derek, question for you. I love this one from James. You talked about the Federal Data Privacy Act and the I guess potential of that. Do you see that following more of what California's done with the CCPA, or do you think it's going to maybe more follow suit with the EU and the GDPR regulations?
If I look into my crystal ball, I would say more like CCPA. Yeah. I just think we're so far entrenched and have so many influential participants in the ecosystem as it is now, that I don't foresee that we would have a situation where we would switch to a consent or permission-based exclusively system, where I think we would still stay with an opt-out. There may be circumstances where you might have it, where you might see it with maybe specialized or sensitive type data or some particularized thing. But as it relates to more general online behavioral advertising, I would think the genie's out of the bottle already. And so pushing it back in would have such profound impact on some significant players that there would just be little chance of that ever happening.
Gotcha. What about here's another one from a Derek. Are there instances where you can deny a person's request to delete their personal information?
Yeah, that's a great question. We talked about this when we were implementing our own internal compliance scheme, when we were thinking about what if we have a current employee who is in California who sends us a request to delete, says delete all my information, or we have somebody who's a user of Basis as a customer and sends us one of those requests. And there are 9 exceptions in the statute for instances when you don't have to delete. Some of them are pretty broad, like if you need to comply with the law, if you need to comply with some legal obligation to keep the information, or there's a broader, more business-related one. It says that you're going to use that information internally in a manner that's compatible with the reason why the consumer provided the information. So if you think about it, if you have somebody who's a user of your product and they want you to delete their email, and their email is used as their login, you can, I think, rightfully deny that type of request simply because they can't use the product if you do. The expectation would be you need to have that information. We need to have that information to use that, to allow them to use the product. So there's a list of 9 different things, but those I think are the bigger ones that provide some safety net for the ability to deny a request to delete.
Excellent. Thanks, Derek. Back to Ian. A few questions about the future of retargeting, remessaging, even some things along the same lines of like account-based marketing. Is that just gone? Should people start preparing for that new future, or do you see some realistic opportunities there?
Sure. So, despite my general remarks about IP addresses, there are limited cases where IP address is suitable to derive some information, largely when it doesn't involve information about particular users. And so, broadly identifying residential versus business, or perhaps identifying big business internet connections, this makes sense and is reasonable from a privacy point of view. So, it's fair to expect that should largely be able to continue to happen. I should note that IP addresses are routinely censored in bid requests sent to DSPs due to privacy concerns already there. So, and that's been the case from Google's exchange for quite some time. So that, maybe we'll see. With regards to retargeting, in its conventional form, there isn't like the viable path forward on retargeting would be via these PII-backed identity platforms or coalitions or products, but it would require collection of like a user email address or something like that. It wouldn't just be on anonymous users. That said, it's still very early. We'll see how this shakes out. It's too early to really call it, but yeah, basic retargeting of anonymous users definitely appears to be significantly curtailed in the future.
And Ian, what about, there's a few different questions. I know you talked about some of the different groups that have gotten together, how that's driven. Some people asking about I think it's the Trade Desk that's got the unified ID, as well as DigiTrust. What are your thoughts on that? What role are those guys going to play?
Well, so unified ID and DigiTrust are a good idea for the purpose of what they're trying to solve for, but it's important to realize that they're not solving for the death of the cookie. They're solving for the fact that in this complicated tangle of ad tech systems, multiple cookie syncs are required to move data from one platform to another, which leads to losing data due to a lack of overlapping user identity. So these are projects to create one big unified cookie pool so that data doesn't get lost moving from platform to platform, but it's backed by third-party cookies. That's the mechanism by which you store the user ID. So without third-party cookies, that goes away. Like really, they're the only way of maintaining user identity without resorting to covert tracking. Assuming browser makers are not going to give us a way to do it, and that's pretty clear, they're against it. The only way involves these PII-backed identity coalitions. But like I said, not going to be 100% coverage.
Yeah, interesting. Derek, a few questions and maybe a point of clarity for the 50,000 consumers. Is that one question from Anthony? Is that just in California or is that nationally? And then Lydia asked a similar kind of question of, is that ever or just within a year? What's the time frame? Can you maybe provide a little bit more clarity there, the 50,000?
I will tell you, I haven't done that kind of deep dive. I got to one for us and didn't go much further, or two really, 1 and 2. But so I'd advise somebody to take a look at the act. My guess is that's probably on a cumulative basis, but I can't say with certainty. My apologies.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we can. Yeah. No worries. We can follow up and offer some clarity. Here's one, Derek. Is CCPA applicable to cookie IDs and mobile IDs? This one from Bill.
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer is maybe. The CCPA, like GDPR, identified those things as items that could potentially be considered personal data. I know a lot of times whenever in the ad tech world, we normally say, well, we don't deal in PII because we only deal with mobile IDs or cookie IDs or something similar. Those can be considered personal data under CCPA, but they have to reasonably be connected to a person, meaning on their own, they might not be, but if you use them in a way where you're able to connect them to other pieces of data and then reasonably identify a specific person, they could be considered personal data under CCPA.
Gotcha. Okay. Very, very helpful. Very helpful. All right. Well, we've got, I'm counting at least 20 additional questions that we're not able to get through. We'll follow up either individually or maybe do a wrap up blog post and share that out so we can kind of speak to that. If Ian, Derek, if you guys have any final thoughts or comments, I'm happy to give you guys the floor before we wrap up. Any closing thoughts or anything?
It's a brave new world. Yeah.
Either because of coronavirus or because of the cookie thing, just don't panic. We're all going to be fine.
Here you go. I like it. I like it. All right. Well, good stuff. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today and sharing your insight, sharing your knowledge, sharing your expertise. Thank you all, the nearly 1,000 folks that joined us for this webinar. I appreciate you all. Appreciate your great questions. This does conclude our presentation for today. Like I mentioned, we'll send out a recording as well as a copy of the slides. And also when you log out, you'll receive a survey. And I truly appreciate you guys giving us some feedback on your experience and even suggestions for future webinars. I'm Ryan Manchi. This has been the webinar series brought to you by the CENTRO Institute. I'm so glad that you joined us. I hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you all.